Well, good morning, everyone. It's great to be here again. I feel blessed to be here with y'all. Grateful for the opportunity and thankful to be asked to speak again. Just so you know, if anybody's interested, after services today, if you want to come fellowship at our house, we're going to have some rabbit stew and some hard-boiled chicken fetuses, followed up with a bunch of sugar in the form of candy, if anybody wants to come join us. So, on a serious note, I am grateful to be here. Thank you for the visitors that come today. If you are visiting, the goal this morning is to make you think a little bit more, to study a little bit more. I'm going to present a lesson that I kind of stumbled across. I really wanted to pursue the what I talked about last time with the Ruach, and talk more about the Ruach Chokmah, which is the Holy Spirit, or the Hagios Pneuma. But in my studies, I kind of come across this subject, and I really wanted to present it, so I thought it was really cool. So with that, we'll get started. The goal this morning is to kind of make a connection from Mount Sinai, where God gives the law, to the upper room on the day of Pentecost. So I know that kind of sounds strange, but we're going to do our best. And to get started, what I need to do is kind of explain first, set up everything. And I'm going to fly through this, so hold on to your seats. So to start off with, you kind of have to understand the Jewish calendar. So the Jewish calendar, which starts in the month of Abib, which is around this time, when is it? Well, it doesn't really matter. The Jewish calendar, or Jewish year, is strictly lunar, being 12 lunations with an average 29 and a half days, making 354 days in the year. The Jewish sacred year begins with the new moon of spring, which comes between our March 22nd and April 25th, in cycles of 19 years. We can understand it best if we imagine our New Year's Day, which now comes on January 1st, without regard to the moon, varying each year with what we know in our American holiday as Easter, the time of the Passover, or the time of the full moon, which, as a new moon, had introduced the new year 2 weeks prior. Hence, the Jewish calendar contains a 13th month, or a leap month, called Viator, or Adar Shani, which is introduced 7 times in every 19 years to render the average length of the year nearly correct and to keep the seasons in the proper months. Keep in mind, too, the Jewish day starts at dusk, at twilight, at dark, and goes to the next day. So our midnight is there right now, 7, 8, 9 o'clock? So keep that in mind. And I apologize, I'm not going to read all this. What we're going to do is kind of go over and set the framework for what I'm going to talk about this morning. So if you want to follow along, you want to read it for yourself, Exodus chapter 12 is where we're going to start. In Exodus chapter 12, and I did not plan this, just as a side note, I did not plan this because of this day. It just happened this way. The end goal has nothing to do with what today represents. But in Exodus chapter 12, we see that God establishes the Passover meal to commemorate the angel of death passing over the nation of Israel. This is done while the Israelites are still in Egypt. God also establishes the first month of the year for the Jews, which is known as Abib, or Nisan. Later becomes Nisan. On the 10th day of the month, the Passover lambs that had no defects were selected for sacrifice and brought into the household. And an interesting side note, in verse 46, it says none of its bones are to be broken. You might want to keep that in mind for later on. Special care to be taken of the lamb, chosen lamb, till the 14th day, and slaughtered at twilight, before dark, when the new day starts, which would be the 15th. Lamb's blood is to cover the door frames. The shed blood on wooden frames keeps death away, so that the death angel does not enter the household. The lambs to be prepared or roasted that night, which is the beginning of the 15th day of that month, and eaten with bitter salad greens and unleavened bread, so that after the angel passes, they are ready to exit Egypt. And I'm paraphrasing all this. It's a brief synopsis of what's going on in Exodus chapter 12. They must be fully dressed and eat quickly and be ready to leave with haste. It establishes yearly feast of unleavened bread for 7 days. First and last day of the feast is considered an official holy day for assembly, or a high Sabbath. What's known as a high Sabbath comes later to be known as a high Sabbath, where no work can be done with the exception of preparing food. This is all in Exodus chapter 12. You ready for yourself? Bread must be made without yeast from the evening of the 14th day, which is known as the day of preparation, verse 18, till the last high Sabbath day on the 21st. I've kind of laid it out here. Anyone found with yeast in their house will be cut off from Israel, verse 19. No one allowed to go through the door till morning, which would be after midnight. This would be halfway through the day or thereabouts on the day of the 15th. So Israel did as God commanded, and the night of the 15th, the angel of death came through and killed the firstborn males of an evil and wicked earthly kingdom. Pharaoh and all of Egypt woke that night, and a loud wailing was heard throughout the land. So Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron that night before daylight in the morning of the 15th. The Israelites took their bread dough without yeast. They stripped the Egyptians of their wealth. That night, about 600,000 Israelite men, including women and children, and a rabble, or a mixed multitude, of non-Israelites, left Ramses and headed for Succoth. So, in 430 years since the time of Joseph, Israel had been in Egypt and had grown to a group of people conservatively estimated to be about 2.4 million people strong, which is roughly the population of Houston. Not greater Houston, just inner Houston. So imagine 2.4 million people leaving Egypt before daylight. They did it at night. God gives instructions that no foreigners are allowed to partake of the Passover meal unless they become circumcised and accept the Hebrew way of life. It brings us to Exodus 13. First of Exodus 13, God dedicates the firstborn of every man and animal to himself. God goes back over the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and he reiterates no yeast to be found in the household or even in the borders of the land, which means from the 14th day, which is the day of preparation, till the 21st day, which is the second high Sabbath of the week-long feast. The firstborn to be presented as a sacrifice when they reach the promised land, but a firstborn donkey can be bought back from God by presenting a lamb or a young goat. Otherwise, its neck has to be broken. Something else interesting to note. So, all firstborn human sons must be brought back with a sacrifice. So when they went into the promised land, they sacrificed the firstborn males of all the animals. You could buy back a donkey, and they had to sacrifice something for the human sons. So they crossed the Red Sea, or the Sea of Reeds, as it's better translated. They get water that's bitter. Moses chunks wood into it, makes it good to drink. They receive manna, which is known as what's this. They collect 1 omer per person, which is about enough to feed each person individually. It's about 2 quarts worth. God establishes the weekly Sabbath, the day of rest, on the last day of the week. Later on, we see Moses put 2 omers in the Ark of the Covenant, probably because they had to collect 2 on Friday, or the day before the Sabbath. And they moved around the wilderness of sin for a little while. They get water from a rock at Rephidim by hitting the rock with a stick. Joshua defeats the Amalekites while Moses keeps his arms up. Moses and Jethro, which is Moses' father-in-law, talk after he brings his wife and kids to see him, and he takes some advice from Jethro. Brief synopsis of what happened. So we get to Exodus chapter 20. They arrive at Mount Sinai in the 3rd month. This is all in Exodus chapter 20. You want to turn there. Which is the month of Sivan. Or Sivan, I can't remember exactly how you pronounce it, after they exited Egypt. We know that's biblical. We can read it. But presumably, and according to Jewish tradition, around the 40-day mark is when they arrived here at Mount Sinai, after they left Egypt. And we can see this from other Jewish documents and rabbinical teachings. So Jewish tradition holds that. Now Moses climbs the mountain. God tells him if the people of Israel will agree to obey and keep his covenant, he'll make them a special people among all others, and all the earth belongs to God. Moses goes back down, tells the people what God said, and they agree. The Israelites consecrate themselves. They mark off a boundary so they don't touch the mountain and risk being stoned to death or shot with arrows, and can't go up the mountain until they hear the long blast of the ram's horn, and they have to abstain and get ready for the third day when God shows up on the mountain to speak to them. So on the third day, and according to Jewish tradition, this should be about the 50th day after the crossing of the Sea of Reeds, or what we hear is the Red Sea, which is pronounced Suf. Reeds is Suf. Thunder roared and lightning flashed. God descends on the mountain in the form of fire, and the whole mountain shook when the people came out of the camp to meet him. The people are scared to death when God thunders back his reply to Moses. Then God gives the instructions to all the people, which means all heard it, including the rabble or the mixed multitude, in their own native language. Again, this is Jewish tradition. We can't prove this biblically, but Jewish tradition in Jesus' time, they would have thought of this or understood this as God spoke to them in their own native language. At the end of the first 10 commandments, the people interrupt God and beg Moses to speak with them alone so that they wouldn't die, because they were scared that they were going to die. So everybody heard the first 10, straight from God. Moses tells them, don't be afraid, for God has come in this way to test you, and so that your fear of him will keep you from sinning. So, we see later on, the Israelites finally leave Mount Sinai 2 years later, on the 20th day of the second month of Ziph, which is in Numbers 10, verse 11, if you want to look it up. After receiving all 611 to 613 laws, there's some debate there, collected into what is known as the Torah, and they wander around the desert for 38 years, which should have taken 11 days to get to the Promised Land. And part of the giving of the law, which the law is given in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and part of giving of the law in Leviticus chapter 23, God goes back over the feasts and festivals. One feast in this chapter that we see that is added is the Feast of the First Fruits, which is verse 9 through 14. I know this is quick, so try to keep up. Hold on to your seats. This feast was to be first observed after they entered the land of Canaan and done yearly during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the day after the weekly Sabbath of that 7-day festival. So, you have 3 Sabbath days in the Feast of Unleavened Bread. 2 high Sabbaths, first of the day, first of the festival and the last of the festival, and the weekly high Sabbath, whichever day that falls on. So, according to verse 15 through 16, the Feast of First Fruits starts the day after the weekly Sabbath, and 49 days are counted down, which is what becomes known as the counting of the Omer in Jewish tradition. On the 50th day of the Festival of Weeks, which begins is outlined in Leviticus 23. The 50th day after the 49-day counting is known as the Feast of Weeks. 7 times 7, 49 days. On the 50th day, you start the Festival of Weeks. This is what the Jews today and in Jesus' time knew as Shavuot, and that's Hebrew. Or, as we see in the Greek New Testament, the 50th day is known as the day of Pentecost. Pentecost means 50 days. Feast of Weeks and Pentecost are the same thing. The reason the counting of the Omer was so important is because it gave the feeling of anticipation for the reading of the Torah, which is what they did during the Feast of Weeks, essentially reenacting the giving of the law at Mount Sinai, which established Israel as a holy nation that supposedly heard in their own native language, and according to Jewish tradition, was done on the 50th day after they were saved by going down through the waters of the Sea of Reeds. This makes sense, but the timeline isn't really clear on how many days they camped before crossing the Sea of Reeds. We know it was at least 2, it could have been 3, and all we know is that they arrived at Mount Sinai in the 3rd month. Whether or not God spoke to the nation on the exact 50th day after the Israelites were saved by the Ruach, if you remember my last lesson, the spirit, the east wind that's parted the waters, is not exactly provable, but could be really cool for what I'm about to go over next. We do know it happened around that same time frame at the very least. So we jump 1,500 years ahead in time, and we get to Jesus' time. So we know according to all 4 Gospels that Jesus had come back to Jerusalem for the Feast of Unleavened Bread, right? Which is commonly referred to as the Passover, to give himself as a sacrifice. So the firstborn Son of God was the Passover lamb for an evil and wicked world. So we know for a fact from what we read in Exodus chapter 12 and 13, Leviticus 23, and Deuteronomy 15 and 16, the Passover meal was on the 15th of Nisan, or Abib, which depends on New Testament versus Old Testament, which is considered a high Sabbath, right? And he had to be in the tomb for 3 days and 3 nights in order to fulfill his own prophecy, which if you want to turn to Matthew chapter 12, verse 40, we'll read right now. It says, and I'm going to back up a little bit to 38. Then some of the scribes and Pharisees answered, saying, Teacher, we want to see a sign from you. But he answered and said to them, An evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Okay. So we do know that he rose on a Sunday, or the first day of the week. It doesn't say Sunday in the biblical text. It just says first day of the week, which would be the morning before daylight, according to Mark 16, 1 through 8. So we can now fill in our timeline. So if this is Sunday, Saturday, Friday, Thursday, Wednesday, Tuesday, Monday. So we can start the journey based on what we have right here and backtrack to connect some dots. So we know 6 days before the Passover meal, according to John chapter 12, verse 1, Jesus visits with Lazarus, right? So the Passover meal, which is always on the 15th of Abib, or Nisan, we count back 6 days. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So he's here with Lazarus. On the next day, we see in John chapter 12, verse 12, which would be a Sabbath day. No, I'm sorry. I may have mistaken that. Which would be on the 10th, which is when the lambs were selected. I need to correct that. Which just so happens to be the 10th of Nisan, which is the very same day the Passover lambs are selected according to what we read in Exodus for slaughter, and they're brought into the household, right? Lambs are selected on the 10th day. Jesus rides into Jerusalem, which is his house, and is selected as the Passover lamb. He even goes into the temple that afternoon after he arrives in Jerusalem, and he looks around and he leaves because it's late afternoon. So we see through the next few days that Jesus struggles with a bunch of stuff. He even runs the people out of the marketplace in the temple, runs the people out of the temple that's using it as a marketplace to sell animals for the feast. He starts healing people. He starts teaching. He does many, many parables, and he challenges the priest's authority. And then we see 2 days before the Passover meal, this is in the text, the priests plot a plan to kill Jesus before the Passover starts. So let's read, we see that in Matthew 26, but let's read Mark 14, verses 1 through 2, real quick. After 2 days, it was the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the chief priests and the scribes sought how they might take him by trickery and put him to death, but they said, "Not during the feast, lest there be an uproar of the people." So they approach Judas and they get him to agree to betray him for 30 pieces of silver. So in order to have a place to prepare the Passover meal on the 15th, Jesus sends out his boys to find a room that is adequate for them to begin the day of preparation, which is on the 14th, which is when they have the evening meal, which is also a meal of unleavened bread, according to Exodus chapter 12, verse 18. This also means there was no yeast in the household, which means that if there is no yeast to be found in the household, there was no yeast in what they drank either. Otherwise, it would be against the law, Torah law. There was no wine there, in case you were wondering. So I know there's some debate on translations. So if we go back to the original Greek, we see in Matthew it says on now the first day of unleavened bread, which would be the day of preparation. First day of unleavened bread is when they found a place to prepare the Passover meal, or prepare for the Passover. Same thing in Mark. On the first day of unleavened bread, when the Passover lambs were to be sacrificed, which would be the 14th, they found a place to prepare for the meal. Same thing in Luke. They came then the day of unleavened bread, which was, it was necessary to be sacrificed for the Passover lamb, which is the day of preparation on the 14th. And we also see in John chapter 13, verse 1, now before the feast of the Passover, knowing that, well, let's just read that. Let's read it from, I'm using the English Standard Version. I'm going to read it straight from here. Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come, that he should depart from this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. And supper being ended, the devil having already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him. So this is before the Passover meal. So we know this happened before the Passover meal. After the Lord's Supper, which was on the day of preparation, which was also a feast of unleavened bread. This is probably why you never see anything mentioned about meat or lamb, because it's just a day of unleavened bread. So they go to the Mount of Olives, where he's arrested, brought before Annas, the former high priest, which is really the acting high priest. Then Caiaphas, the appointed high priest of Pilate. Then the Sanhedrin council, all before daylight on the 14th. Then Pilate, early in the morning, which coincidentally makes him ceremonially unclean. And we see that the accusers of Jesus did not go into Pilate's house because they would have defiled themselves before the Passover, John 18, verse 28. Then he goes to Herod, then he goes back to Pilate. So he's beaten and crucified on the cross around 9 a.m. our time, which is about the same time they would have started slaughtering the Passover lambs on the 14th. Here. He would have died around 3 p.m. our time, which is when they would have finished killing the lambs, and he had to be taken down and buried by 6 p.m. or so, which is when the next day started and the Passover began on the 15th day of Nisan, which Jesus is the Passover lamb. Mark 15, verse 42, we read, Now, when evening had come, because it was the preparation day, that is the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent council member, who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God, coming and taking courage, went into Pilate, blah, blah, blah. Nicodemus also helped him. So we see that this day of preparation, or parasuke in Greek, we see right here, early evening had arrived since it was the day of preparation. That is the day before the Sabbath. So we know this happened before the Passover. Okay, so Jesus was put in the heart of the earth by Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent Sanhedrin council member, and Nicodemus, a Pharisee, before dark on the 14th, on the day of the 14th. The next day on the Sabbath, which was a high Sabbath, the day of Passover, when no work can be done, the priest asked Pilate to appoint guards to the tomb. So he's dead in the tomb for 3 days, which means if he rose on the first day of the week, the weekly Sabbath is on the 17th. After the weekly Sabbath was over and Jesus rose, just like he said he would in Matthew 12, verse 40, after 3 days, 3 whole days and 3 whole nights of being in Sheol before daylight, the day would have been recognized as the Feast of First Fruits, which is when the counting of the Omer started for Shavuot to begin in 50 days. We know he rose before daylight after the Sabbath was over between midnight and daybreak because Mary Magdalene and Mary, mother James, and Salome came around dawn, according to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and while it was still dark, according to John, to put spices on the body, and they found the tomb empty. This was after the Sabbath, the weekly Sabbath. If you're interested, here's a very nice chart that I found that kind of lays all that out. I can get it to you. I don't know who made it, but I thought it was pretty cool. So it lays it out directly and even has our Gentile calendar versus the Jewish calendar, our days. So, after that, Jesus hangs around for about 40 days. As we see in Acts chapter 1, verse 3, he appears to more than 500 people, which we see in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 6. Then the day of Pentecost arrives. Acts chapter 2, verse 1. There was a sound from heaven like the roaring of a mighty windstorm, and flames of tongues of fire appeared over each person that began to speak in every language simultaneously. So we need to make a connection here of the giving of the Torah. Remember, this is the feast beginning of remember this is the day of the Feast of Weeks when they would gather to hear the Torah read. The Jewish tradition holds true that we can't exactly prove, but we know is approximate time-wise, and God's people were saved from bondage from a wicked nation on Passover when a sacrifice was made and killed the day before the meal took place, and God's people were established through a covenant 50 days after they went through the water that buried their old way of life. 3 days after they ate the Passover meal, just like what Jesus did for us and established his new covenant with mankind on this day as his church was established, giving himself a sacrifice for a wicked world, saving us from the bondage of sin after everyone is baptized in water and completely immersed with the Holy Spirit as it is poured out on them, much in the same way kings were anointed in the Old Testament, the way Jesus was anointed at Simon the leper's house before his death, at his baptism, and the way we are when we obey and are baptized in his words, the law becomes written on our hearts so that we can have forgiveness. Everything lines up. Everything's connected. So, Exodus chapter 20. The Hebrew word for thunders, if you want to go back and study the original Hebrew, is hakalot, which means a loud call, or a loud voice, or loud sound. The Hebrew word for lightning is lapaid, which means to shine as in a lamp or flickering flame. Sound familiar? Supposedly all heard in their own language, so it was a full sensory overload right here. Everybody knew this was an amazing thing. The law was given and God's people were set apart. Acts chapter 2, there was a sound from heaven like a mighty rushing wind. It was a loud noise. People knew what was going on. Tongues of fire appeared and rested on each of them, just like lapaid. all heard in their own language. It was a full sensory overload. Once again, the story of Jesus was told. The people believed and were baptized, setting themselves apart from the rest of the world and writing a law in their hearts, being fully forgiven because of the final perfect sacrifice that was made. That ends that. I know. Last thing, I promise. Just as a postscript. People that were not Galileans said that they heard the apostles speaking in their native tongue. At the same time, people of other nationalities heard in their own native tongue. So there were mockers there, most likely Galileans. They said that those people that heard in their own native tongue were probably full of wine. Not necessarily the apostles, because they didn't speak Galilean. Peter stands up and says, no, they're not drunk. So I just kind of wanted to throw that in there. We've always heard just the opposite, that they were accusing the apostles. I think it was the other way around. They were accusing the people that weren't Galileans that were drunk. And Peter stands up and defends them. The mockers weren't saying these things about the apostles. They were calling the people that heard in their native language drunk. Peter doesn't defend himself and the apostles. He defends the people of other nationalities. I know that was a lot. I'm sorry, and I went way over time. But I hope you see the connection here. I hope you learned something from it. I hope you study it for yourself. If you have any questions or if you are misunderstanding anything, please let me know. And with that, the lesson's yours. We'll be dismissed to class.